So, good evening, and I feel very happy to be here. This was the first time I'm visiting Sravasti Abbey. Well, I've wanted to come for many years now, so it was wonderful that I finally have a chance to come here. And I didn't expect to be invited to teach. I just wanted to come and hang out, but I got. But anyway, I feel very honored to have the chance to teach here as well. So, what I was asked to talk about or teach this weekend is this topic of the art of transforming suffering. And this is actually a big topic. There's a lot of material, but we'll just cover as much as we can. And so, part of the time, you may have seen the schedule, part of the time I'll be talking, giving talks, and there will also be meditation times and time for discussion, question and answer, and so on. So I will try my best to remember to keep time at the end of each of my talks for questions. So if you do have questions that come up about the material I'm covering, try to keep them in mind or write them down, and I'll do my best to answer them. I thought to start by just looking at some of the Buddhist views or Buddhist attitudes about happiness and suffering, because I understand some of you are relatively new to Buddhism. Is that correct? Yes? Okay. Okay, don't be shy. we all start somewhere. So in general, with regard to the Buddha's teachings, when the Buddha himself was teaching, he told his listeners to not just blindly, unquestioningly accept what he was saying, and instead he said, you should think about what I'm saying, check it out for yourself, investigate it, and decide for yourself if it's true or not. And so that's the Buddhist attitude, that we should use our own intelligence, our own ability to think and discriminate and figure out for ourselves what's true and not true, what's right and not, what's helpful and not. So that's very much encouraged in the Buddhist tradition. So it's completely fine to have doubts and questions and, express your thoughts and discuss them and so forth. So just to let you know that if you're new to Buddhism. But anyway, I thought to mention a few of the Buddhist views or attitudes regarding happiness and suffering. So one is that suffering is a natural part of life. That is, those of us who are not enlightened beings, we always experience problems and suffering. Not always, but I mean, it's just a natural part of our life, of our existence, to meet with problems, with difficulties. And also this term suffering is sometimes misunderstood. Some teachers and some writers actually prefer the word unsatisfactoriness, because the word suffering often has the connotation of something really severe, really heavy, like war or cancer or, being raped or abused. But the word in traditional Buddhist languages like Pali and Sanskrit and so on, it really has more the sense of just something that's unpleasant or unsatisfying. And so it covers a whole range of different kinds of experiences, from just a little bit of discomfort in our body or a little bit of discomfort in our mind, just something minor, all the way to very severe suffering, like being tortured or in terrible pain and so on. So there's a whole range of different experiences that are included in this term suffering. So if you prefer another term like unpleasantness or unsatisfactoriness or problems or whatever, that's what it covers. So it means that all of us who are not enlightened beings, who haven't yet attained enlightenment, we inevitably experience problems and suffering. We can't expect to go through life without meeting with problems and suffering. And there are beings who are free of suffering. We call them enlightened beings or Buddhas. This is the state the Buddha himself attained. And so anyway, according to Buddhism, this is going back to the beginning, suffering is a natural part of life. Everybody experiences it. And with the exception of those who have reached enlightenment, who have attained the enlightened state, so they don't experience suffering. And according to Buddhism, it's possible for everyone to reach that state of enlightenment. So it isn't just special people or special beings who are able to do that, but all of us, all living beings, are able to reach enlightenment. So, according to Buddhism, there are various views about suffering and happiness. So one is that suffering is a natural part of our life, part of our existence. Everybody experiences except those who've reached enlightenment. But that sounds rather depressing or pessimistic, and it's not really that bad, because suffering is not something permanent that will be there forever and ever. It's impermanent, it's transitory, it comes and goes, and it is possible for all of us to eventually reach the point where we don't experience any more suffering. And in fact, that's the whole point of Buddhism. The whole goal of Buddhism is to reach a point of no more suffering. And according to Buddhism, it's also possible to do that. It's possible, and it's also something we deserve. So according to Buddhism, this is something the Dalai Lama talks about a lot, that not just the Dalai Lama, all the Lamas, they often start their talks by saying, all sentient beings want happiness, and all sentient beings want to be free of suffering. So that's just like something accepted in Buddhism, that everybody, not just human beings, but even animals, insects, all living beings, have this deep, natural, instinctive wish to be happy and to not suffer. And when it comes to this term happy or happiness, it doesn't necessarily mean this, really excited, whoopee kind of experience, but even the most, even to have our basic needs fulfilled. For example, food. We have stomachs. Our stomachs get empty, and when they're empty, it's uncomfortable, and we want to, have something to eat. If we manage to find something to eat, fill our stomachs, and then take away the unpleasantness of hunger, then we feel happy. So this is something we can see in all living beings. Animals, when they get something to eat, they're happy. If they don't, they're unhappy. So happiness starts from that very basic fulfillment of our needs and our wishes for food, for comfort, for shelter, for safety, for attention, and so forth. So from there up to Buddhism describes very high levels of happiness that probably most people in the world are not even aware of. So there's actually many different kinds of happiness, not only one kind of happiness that everybody experiences. But basically, we all have this wish for happiness, and the opposite side of that, like the other side of the coin, is that we wish to not suffer. Nobody wants pain, nobody wants to be hurt, nobody wants to be deprived of our needs and our wishes. Nobody wants to suffer, basically. So this is something that exists in every person, in every living being. This is something, for you to check out, to investigate, to see if it's true or not. But this is what the Buddhist view, that every being wants happiness and doesn't want to suffer. And on top of that, every being has the right to experience happiness and to avoid suffering or be free of suffering. So it's like a right as living beings, not just human beings, but living beings, that we have the right to be happy. Or we could say we deserve to be happy. Now this is something you may not find explicitly mentioned in Buddhist texts. I haven't actually come across that it's explicitly mentioned, but I think it's something we can understand implicitly. because of, as I mentioned before, Buddhism has the view that every living being has the ability, the potential to be free of suffering and to experience happiness. This is what's called our Buddha nature. Buddha nature refers to the true nature, the real nature of our mind, basically, of our being. So it's basically clear and pure and can be developed, can be brought to a state of complete freedom from suffering and its causes and complete happiness and peace and perfection of everything that's good and positive. So this is a basic tenet of Buddhism, or at least Mahayana Buddhism, that every living being has that ability or that potential to transcend suffering, become free of suffering, and reach a state of happiness. So since that potential is there, that ability is there, that means that it's perfectly okay, it's natural, it's normal for us to reach a state of peace and happiness and freedom from suffering. So everybody can do it, and also everybody will do it. Eventually, it may take time, and we can't expect it to happen necessarily in this lifetime, but eventually, sooner or later, every being will achieve happiness and freedom from suffering. So even though suffering is there, it's a part of life, but it's something that can be overcome, can be eliminated. It's possible to be free of it. And we have the right to do that, we have the ability to do that, we can do it. And it's basically a question of working on our mind. That's the most important thing. It doesn't mean we don't also try to work on the external circumstances, external conditions to bring about comfort and happiness and so forth. But we can see in the world that even people who have a lot in terms of material resources, billionaires, millionaires, celebrities, people who have really wonderful lifestyles, so they have everything they could possibly wish for and need in terms of external circumstances or causes for happiness, but sometimes they're not really happy inside. They still have internal suffering. So that shows that just having material resources isn't a guarantee of internal happiness. So according to Buddhism, the most important factor is really our mind, what's going on inside of our mind. And within Buddhism, within the Buddhist teachings, there are many, many methods we can use for working on our mind and bringing about a transformation of our mind, such that we have less suffering and unhappiness and more happiness. And in fact, I've sometimes heard when the Dalai Lama is teaching, especially in India, I've heard him mention that that's actually the essence of Buddhism. The essence of Buddhism is working on our mind to bring about a transformation of our mind. And the meaning of transformation of the mind, transforming the mind, is basically to reduce, lessen, decrease the factors within the mind that are the cause of unhappiness and suffering, and increase, cultivate those factors in the mind that are the cause of happiness. So, for those of you who are new to Buddhism or relatively new to Buddhism, I'll just say a little bit about the mind, because we do talk a lot about the mind in Buddhism. And in the West, among Western scientists, psychologists, and so on, there's different views about the mind, what the mind is, or even if it exists at all. There's some who deny it. But according to Buddhism, we definitely do have a mind. The mind does exist. And what the mind is something non-physical. So it's not our brain. Many people in the world believe the mind is the brain, or a product of the brain, or a function of the brain, dependent on the brain. But according to Buddhism, it's not. It's not the brain or anything physical. It's not any part of our physical body. Instead, it's a non-physical, non-material kind of phenomena maybe we could call it energy, kind of non-physical energy. And non-physical means it's not made of particles, atoms, cells, any kind of physical material, meaning we can't see it. We can't actually see the mind with our eyes, or even with the most powerful instruments that scientists have come up with so far. They're not able to see the mind because those instruments and our eyes and so forth are only function with physical things. We can only see physical things. Mind is non-physical. So it cannot be seen with our eyes or with instruments. It cannot be touched. It cannot be felt. It cannot be measured. It doesn't have any physical properties at all. It doesn't have, shape or size or color or weight or smell or anything like that. So it's completely non-physical. Now that itself makes it difficult even to believe in, because people tend to think, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. Yeah. If it's not visible to the eye or to the instruments that we have, then it doesn't exist. But on the other hand, all we have to do is look inside of ourselves and look at our thoughts and our feelings and our experiences, and they definitely do exist. So the term mind in Buddhism, as I say, it's this non-physical kind of energy, and it's a sort of umbrella term that covers all of our conscious experiences, and that means our thoughts, so all of the thoughts that are going on 24 hours a day, but anyway, much of the time we have thoughts going on, blah, 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 saying things, making comments on things, thinking about things, and so on. So all of those are our mind, included in our mind. But it also includes our emotions. So all the different kinds of emotions or feelings that we have, happy, unhappy, sad, frightened, anxious, worried, angry, hurt, jealous, and so on. So there's a whole range of different emotions or feelings that we have. And according to Buddhism, those are also part of our mind. It's not like, in the West, sometimes there's this tendency to separate intellect and emotion. Intellect being the thinking, rational part of our experience, and emotion being something else. So according to Buddhism, they're not really separate. They are all parts of the mind. They're all included in this term mind. And it also includes our basic perceptions, such as seeing, hearing, smell, taste, touch, feelings in our body. Those are also part of our mind. And it also includes what happens in our mind during the night when we're asleep. We have dreams, so dreams are part of our mind. And even when we're not dreaming, and we're just in a dreamless state of unconsciousness, according to Buddhism, our mind is still there. It's still active, functioning, experiencing things, even if it's just darkness. So mind is actually present, active, 24 hours a day, non-stop. It never stops. It never takes a break. It never has a break. It's constantly going, constantly doing something, experiencing something, even in states of deep sleep or coma, when a person is in a coma. According to Buddhism, the person's mind is still there, experiencing something, even if it's just a very, very deep or very subtle experience. So it's constantly active, constantly experiencing something. And it's constantly changing as well. So we shouldn't think of mind as being like an organ or a thing sitting inside of us, always in the same place, always in the same state, and just having these different experiences. Instead of that kind of image, it's better to think of a stream or a river, which is constantly moving and changing. And also a stream or river is made up of different particles of, H2O, molecules of water, and so on. So it's these, different individual particles moving along and changing constantly. So in a similar way, our mind is made up of many, many different types of experiences, which are constantly moving, changing. And so it's not the same from one moment to the next. Our mind is actually different. So every single moment, every single nanosecond, there's something different going on in our mind. It's constantly moving and changing. So that's just a little bit about the mind, but this is a whole body of knowledge in Buddhism about the mind, different types of mind, and how the mind works, and so on and so forth. But in a very general way, one way of talking about the mind is in terms of certain aspects or factors of the mind that are the cause of unhappiness, suffering, problems. And other facets or aspects of the mind are the cause of happiness and peace and good experiences. So this is one general way of dividing up the mind. And sometimes the terms positive and negative are used. Positive states of mind are those that bring happiness, and negative ones are those that bring suffering and unhappiness. So one of the best examples of a negative state of mind is anger or hatred. This is something we all experience sometimes with a person, for example, who is annoying or irritating or acts in ways that we don't approve of, that we don't agree with. They might be harming ourselves, they might be harming other people, they may be behaving in, very destructive ways, and so on. So towards a person like that, we might have these feelings of anger or hatred, irritation, annoyance, criticalness, and so on. So that is one of the negative states of mind. And the reason it's called negative is because when that type of attitude, anger or hatred, is present in our mind, it disturbs our mind. Our mind is disturbed, unpeaceful, unhappy. And this is again something you can check for yourself with your own experience. How do you feel when that is happening in your mind, when you're feeling angry or hateful or annoyed or irritated or critical or judgmental? Is that a nice state of mind, a pleasant state of mind? Do you feel happy? Do you feel good? Or not? Okay, so that's a good example of a negative state of mind. And then as an example of a positive state of mind, we can take the opposite, which is love or loving kindness. And that's the feeling we have towards people or beings that we care about, that we cherish, that we find dear and precious and worthy of our respect, worthy of our care. So our family members, our friends, our pets, and so on. So there's certain people or certain beings towards whom we have these very warm and caring feelings, at least sometimes. We can also be angry at them too. But at those times when we're not angry and hateful, but we care about them and cherish them and so on. So that feeling of love or loving kindness. Again, if we check how we feel at such times, what is that state of mind like? We'll probably find it's kind of very nice, very sweet, very pleasant, very beautiful. It's a nice feeling to have. So we can see just in an immediate way that certain states of mind are unpleasant, make us unhappy, and other states of mind are very pleasant, make us happy. So when the Dalai Lama talks about transforming the mind, that this is the essence of Buddhism, the meaning of that is working on our mind so that the negative states of mind, those that make us unhappy, are reduced. We have less of those. And the positive states of mind, the ones that make us happy, are increased so that we feel them more often, more of the time. And this is definitely possible. I can say it with 100% conviction because it's definitely been my experience and many others as well. So it's possible to do that. So we can gradually reduce the negative, gradually increase the positive, and eventually, just like with that old-fashioned kind of scales that they have, where you have two pans and you put, more things on one side and that goes down and the other one goes up. You know that what I'm talking about? So it's a bit like that. So if we put more emphasis on positive states of mind and have more of those, then that becomes much more heavy or much more our normal experience, and we take away the negative states of mind, so that one becomes less and lighter. So it's definitely possible to do that with our mind. It's a gradual process. We can't do it immediately in one moment or overnight or even in a year or 2 or 3, but gradually over time we can definitely transform our mind. So then this point of suffering, this question of suffering. So since suffering does happen to us in our life, it's important to learn how to work with it, how to deal with it. And that too is definitely possible. And with regard to where we find information about this in the Buddha's teaching, some of you are probably familiar with the Lamrim, or the Path to Enlightenment teachings. For those who are not familiar with that, Lamrim is a Tibetan term. Lam means path, and Rim means stages. So we usually translate it as stages of the path, or sometimes it's called the graduated path, because it's basically taking the most important teachings of the Buddha, the most important things that the Buddha taught, and arranging them in a kind of step-by-step way, showing us what we need to do to get from here, where we are now, unenlightened and still having problems and suffering, all the way to the state of enlightenment, where we are free of problems and suffering and able to experience the greatest peace and happiness. So it's a bit like a roadmap. Like if you want to drive from here to Seattle or San Francisco or whatever, it's best to have a road map to know where you're going. So many different roads. So you want to make sure you know which roads to take, which turns to make, and so on and so forth. So you end up in the right place. So the Lamrim is a bit like that. It's like a road map showing us the road, the route, the way to get from here to enlightenment. And so it's made up of many different topics or subjects that we learn about and meditate on and so forth. So within the Lamrim, there's the topic of patience. Patience is a practice, of course everybody needs to practice patience, but it's particularly a practice for the bodhisattvas, those who are really bound and determined to attain enlightenment. And the main practices they need to engage in are what are called the 6 perfections. Have you heard of the 6 perfections? Okay, so the 6 perfections are giving, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. So those are the most essential practices a bodhisattva needs to engage in. So patience is one of those. And there's different kinds of patience. One kind of patience is learning how to deal with our anger, learning how to manage anger. When anger comes up or hatred comes up towards another person or towards a whole group of people or towards a situation or whatever. So since anger is potentially dangerous, it can become a cause of a lot of suffering and problems. We need to learn how to deal with anger, to not end up doing destructive things. So that's one kind of patience. But then there's another kind of patience, which is called the patience of voluntarily accepting suffering. And this is all about how to deal with suffering, how to deal with problems. When problems happen in our life, when we encounter difficulties and problems, how to deal with them in a wise and skillful way. Because I have a quote on here, but I'll just paraphrase it. It's from the Lamrim Chenmo, the great exposition of the stages of the Path to Enlightenment by Lama Tsongkhapa. So this is, a big, thick book all about the Path to Enlightenment. And in there he says that when suffering happens, when problems happen, if we don't know how to transform it, then there's the danger that either we generate hostility or we become discouraged. And in either case, that is kind of a danger to our being able to continue to follow the path. So I'll try to get that quotation for you tomorrow up on the screen. But for me, that was a really powerful and quite juicy quotation. Because the thing is, I don't know if this is something any of you have ever experienced, but I think it happens to some people when they get involved in a spiritual path, like Buddhism. You start to study and you start to practice and you start to make changes in your life and try to be a better person, a nicer person, and so on. So you have this idea, I'm following a spiritual path. And it's possible, maybe unconsciously rather than consciously, we might have the idea that, oh, now I'm on a good path, and so things should go really well for me. I shouldn't have any problems, I shouldn't have any difficulties, and you may have that expectation. And then problems do happen, yeah? And you feel kind of, hey, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to be happening. Have you ever had that experience or heard of that experience? Yeah, so I think that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about. He says, if you're following a spiritual path and you encounter problems and you don't know how to handle them, then there's that problem of, well, he mentioned hostility as one danger that can happen, but another one is discouragement. I think this is something that does happen to people. I've had it myself. You sometimes feel, wait a minute, things should be going well for me. I'm behaving myself. I'm doing good things. Dharma, I'm practicing Dharma. Dharma is the cause of happiness, and it's supposed to eliminate suffering. So why am I having this problem? It shouldn't be happening, right? So we can sometimes get a bit shocked, and this can, if we're not careful, it can lead us to actually become discouraged and think, okay, it's not working. This is supposed to bring me happiness, and it's not. So maybe I'm on the wrong path. Maybe I'm wasting my time. Maybe I should just give it up. So this does happen to people. People do become discouraged, give up practicing because they feel like it's not working. So I think one problem there is having unrealistic expectations, having an expectation that problems should not be happening to me. Now, is that realistic? Is it realistic that just because you started following this path, you started walking on the path, everything should be wonderful, everything should be rosy, everything should go great for you, smooth and easy, and there shouldn't be any difficulties or problems happening in your life? I mean, is that a realistic expectation to have? Maybe it's wishful thinking, but is it realistic? I mean, if we just look at examples, stories of the great practitioners of the past, such as the Buddha. Did the Buddha have an easy time? Yeah, or Milarepa, did he have an easy time? Jesus, did he have an easy time? The Dalai Lama, did he have a smooth, wonderful, easy life? Yeah. So if we just look at the lives of spiritual practitioners of various traditions, I'm sure we'll find in all cases that they didn't have an easy time. They had problems. They had difficulties. But they didn't give up. They didn't get discouraged and give up practicing. They kept practicing in spite of the difficulties. And due to that, they eventually, gained success in the path, in the practice. So then, isn't it a bit presumptuous of us to think that, well, they have problems, but I shouldn't have any problems. My path should be smooth and easy. So there's a misunderstanding there, that yes, Dharma, what we call Dharma, Buddha's teaching, the Buddhist path, it is a path that leads out of suffering, that leads to happiness and peace. But does that mean right from the beginning, right from, the first step on the path, we should have nothing but happiness and peace and good experiences and no more suffering? Yeah, it's not realistic to think that way. And from the Buddhist point of view, the explanation behind that is that we didn't just start existing in this lifetime, but we had many lives before this. And we are carrying with us imprints of the actions that we did in our past lives. And we haven't always been good boys and girls. We've created some negative things. Even in this lifetime, I'm sure. We've all done some bad things. So the bad things we've done, the hurtful things we've done, and dishonest things we've done, and so on, have left imprints in our mind, karmic imprints. And those don't just go away all at once just because we start taking a few steps on the path. it takes time. It is possible to purify the mind, to purify our karma, to purify our negative states of mind, but it takes time. Slowly, slowly, little by little, it's possible to do that. So to expect that all of that causes of suffering will go away right from the beginning is just not realistic. So that's one thing to consider. But another thing to think about is that facing problems, difficulties, suffering, hardship, and so on isn't necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, this is our usual reaction is, oh no, this is bad, I don't want it. This is a problem, this is an obstacle, it's nothing but bad. And that's something else to consider, to question, to look at. Is it necessarily bad to go through problems and suffering? And in fact, according to Buddhism, it's not necessarily bad. There's actually good things that can come out of going through hardships and problems and difficulties. We can learn from them, we can grow from them, we can even transform them into the path. We can make them part of the path that will, and instead of, making us miserable and unhappy and, knotted up with suffering, they can actually help us to have more wisdom, more compassion, to create more causes for enlightenment, to actually get closer to enlightenment rather than, overwhelmed. Does that make sense? So that's actually the whole point of this topic, the art of transforming suffering. So it's actually an art, a skill, something we can learn, something we can put into practice. And so we can actually work with problems, use problems, and make them something useful, something beneficial for ourselves and for others. But I think, so there's lots of methods which I'll be going through over the weekend, different methods that we can use on how to do this, how to use problems and suffering when they happen to us. But I think one important first step is to look at how we normally respond, how we normally react when suffering and problems happen. Because I think we need to get to know our own mind. Before we can transform our mind, we need to know our mind. We need to know how our mind works. And probably, my guess is, for most people, maybe there's some exceptions to this, but probably most people, when a problem happens, something unpleasant happens in the life, one's initial reaction, gut level reaction, is rejection, is aversion, is dislike. I don't want this, I don't like this shouldn't be happening to me. We don't sort of welcome it and say, hello, how are you? My friend, I'm happy to see you. We don't have that kind of reaction, and we have the opposite reaction of wanting to push it away or wanting to run away from it. This is another thing that's common, is to try to escape from it rather than face it and deal with it. And there's a sutra in the Pali canon, the Pali tradition, called the Celica Sutra. I don't know if you've heard of that. Some of you have. In this sutra, the Buddha talks about arrows. He says that when something unpleasant or painful happens, whether it's like sickness or pain or some emotional problem or life problem, when that kind of thing happens to us, it's like being shot with an arrow, being struck with an arrow. It's painful. It hurts. I mean, it is painful. We shouldn't pretend that it's not. It is painful. It is unpleasant. So there's that first arrow that we are shot with, that we are suffering from. But then the Buddha says, in the way we react or respond to this unpleasant experience in our life, we might shoot ourselves with a second arrow, another arrow. And that becomes doubly painful. Having one arrow is bad enough. Having two arrows is even worse. doubly painful. So what he is referring to is the way we react with feelings like aversion, dislike, or just being upset, or having thoughts like, why me? Why is this happening to me and other people not having this experience? So there's various kinds of reactions that our mind may get into, that instead of facing the problem, dealing with it in a positive way, we actually just create more suffering, more problems for ourselves, like shooting ourselves with a second arrow. So one thing that's good to look at in our mind is that there's like 3 steps in a process. First, there's the initial experience. For example, maybe some pain, some discomfort in your body, or some illness, something unpleasant. Okay? So that's like the initial experience. Second step is the reaction, how your mind reacts to that, how your mind responds to that. And is it a positive response, or is it a response with, unhappiness and aversion and dislike and wanting to run away and so on? I know I do that, so don't feel bad, if you that's something you do. I still do it myself, even though I should know better. But yeah, I can see my mind saying, oh no, I don't want this, I don't need this, I don't like this, I want this to go away, I want myself to go away from it, I want to separate from that problem. So I think that's just a natural reaction. I don't think we should feel bad about that. We're just ordinary, unenlightened beings, so we just naturally have that kind of reaction. Then the next step is that our mind may get into sort of thinking and making stories about the whole situation, such as, one example is, this problem is going to be there forever. There's this tendency to see the problem as something permanent. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah, like you get into an unhappy state of mind, or some kind of problem happens, and it can appear as if, it's like huge and overwhelming, and it's going to be there forever. It's never going to go away. And this isn't something we necessarily consciously and deliberately think. It's just an automatic reaction. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you noticed that? Yeah? It just seems like it's going to last forever. So this is actually it's not true, okay? It's simply not true. No problem is forever. No problem exists forever. But this is one sort of mistaken way that our mind can react or respond to a problem, making it worse, making ourselves suffer more rather than better. And then there's the self-pity story, like, poor me, why me, other people don't have this problem. And it can even seem sometimes, this is really exaggerated, but, like, I'm the only person in the world who has this problem. Everybody else is doing really well. They're happy, they're flourishing, they don't have problems like me. I'm the only one. Have you ever noticed that kind of mentality? Yeah? So these kind of things come up in our mind, and sometimes we just go into them. We just go along with them. We buy into them. We believe in them, and just get into a greater state of misery than we had before. And they're just not true. It's just not true that you are the only person in the world who has a problem. There's millions, zillions of people, beings in the world who have the same kind of problem, even worse problems. So can you see what I'm saying, that these kind of thoughts that come up in our mind can just increase the suffering, make the suffering worse. Like Buddha said, shooting yourself with more arrows, or another way of understanding it is just adding more layers. Like there's the basic situation, the basic problem that's there, and then you're adding more layers to it, making it thicker, making it heavier, making it worse. Not that we do this deliberately or consciously. It's just an automatic thing that happens in our mind. And we tend to just go along with it. We tend to just buy into it and believe in it. But the good news is we don't have to do that. We can make choices as to what goes on in our mind, or at least we can choose not to believe in the stories that our mind is telling us. You know? It takes time, it takes effort, but we can learn to do this. And then we can say other things to ourselves. For example, this problem is not permanent, it's not going to last forever, it's impermanent, because everything is impermanent. Everything is transitory. Okay, so that includes problems and suffering. So we can tell ourselves that story, and that sometimes that itself gives a tremendous relief. You know, just to remind yourself, it's not going to be there forever. Right now it's pretty bad, right now it's pretty awful, it's not pleasant, but it's not going to be there forever. And if you have a hard time believing that, you can just remember past experiences you had when you had some kind of problem and it felt like it's going to be there forever, but it wasn't. It went away at some point. Yeah? So you can just go by your own experiences to assure yourself, reassure yourself that it's not going to be there forever. And, or the other story about, I'm not the only one who suffers. Other people suffer too. And some people have much worse problems than we do. Right now, I mean, just look at what's happening in Africa. People are starving to death. Look what's happening in Syria. All the Syrian refugees. People right here in this country, you know, so many people. Homeless, addicts. So much suffering right here in our own country. So when you look at your problem in relation to the problems other people have, then that can make your own problem appear smaller. This is something that Dalai Lama talks about. He's used it in his own experience, that focusing on your own problem can make it seem really huge, like a mountain. You know, this expression, making a mountain out of a molehill. So with this obsessive thinking, my problem is so horrible, it's so terrible, then it can really blow up like a balloon, like a mountain. But then when you turn your attention away from my problem and think about others' problems, what's going on with other people, then your problem can seem smaller. Now, I'm not sure if this will work every time, but it definitely can be helpful, at least sometimes, that your problem will seem smaller. When it seems smaller, then you get this feeling like, I can manage it. I can manage it. Instead of it being unmanageable, you can see it as manageable. I can manage it. So it gives you sort of courage and strength to be able to manage the problem. Now, just to mention here, in saying this, talking about transforming our mind, transforming our thoughts and our attitudes about a problem, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't also try to find solutions to our problems. We should just sit there and suffer with our problem and try to change our mental attitude about it. It doesn't mean that. If there are solutions, if there are remedies, if there are ways to get rid of the problem, you know, remedy the problem, that's perfectly fine. We can do these, as long as we're not doing something that's illegal or unethical or harmful, okay? So as long as you keep within ethical guidelines, it's completely fine to solve your problem. However, the problem may not immediately disappear. It might still be there for a while. So while it's still there, then it's useful to have these other methods for working with it on the mental level. So I thought maybe let's just do a little bit of meditation on what I've been talking about to see if it can sink in a little deeper. So make yourselves comfortable as much as you can. Try to sit with your back straight. But that doesn't mean being tense or tight. So at the same time, try to have a relaxed body. Let go of any tension there may be in your body. And if you're feeling sleepy, you might want to keep your eyes open a little bit, because closing the eyes can lead to sleepiness. Keeping them open a little bit, looking down onto your lap or the floor in front of you, can help you to stay awake. And just let the breath flow in and out in a natural rhythm. Don't control your breathing. Allow your body to breathe as it normally does. And with your mind, just be aware of the breath as it's coming in and going out. Now bring to mind some problem or difficulty or unpleasant experience that might be happening to you right now, this moment, or in your life in general. It doesn't have to be a big problem. It could just be some discomfort or pain in your body, some physical problem, or it could be some emotional problem, something you're worried about, upset about. So when you think of this problem, when this problem comes up in your mind, try to notice how your mind reacts or responds to it. Does it respond with friendliness? Oh yeah, this is nice. I'm happy that this is there. Or does it respond with aversion, dislike? Oh no, I don't want this. I want this to go away. Just check how your mind responds. There may also be fear, as if the problem is so huge, overwhelming, that you cannot manage it, you cannot handle it, cannot deal with it. And it may seem as if it's going to be there forever and will never change or go away. So if your mind does have any of those reactions, don't feel bad about that. Don't judge yourself, put yourself down for having such reactions. It's completely normal and understandable. But just check to see if it's helpful to have such reactions. Is it helpful, or does it just make things worse? Does it just increase your unhappiness, your suffering, to have such thoughts, such feelings, such reactions in response to the problem? And then, what do you think about the idea that it's possible to change the way your mind reacts to, responds to deals with suffering and problems. Do you think that's possible? That you can learn new ways, different ways of responding to problems? And if you can accept that, is that something you would like to do? And one such different way of dealing with problems is simply to be more accepting of them. To simply have the attitude that problems are a natural and inevitable part of our life. We can't expect to go through life without experiencing problems. See if you can adapt that attitude and just come to accept that as I go through life, even if I'm following a spiritual path, I cannot avoid experiencing problems. But the good news is it is possible to use problems in ways that are beneficial for ourselves, for others, beneficial for our practice, helping us get closer to enlightenment rather than being obstacles to our attainment of enlightenment. So we have a few minutes left. If anybody would like to ask a question.
You mentioned that there were a couple of different definitions for suffering. I once heard that a different definition for dukkha was instead of suffering, difficult to bear. Is that a correct one?
I didn't. Yeah, I think what I said was there's different terms or descriptions rather than definitions. Difficult to bear. That could be one.
Okay.
Actually, just as you were asking that, I thought of this one translator in the Theravada tradition, Venerable Thanissaro, who's translated a lot of texts from the Pali, and he uses the word stress. He translates dukkha as stress. Yeah. Anyway, so there's lots of different words or terms or descriptions that are used for suffering. I think Venerable Chudron just uses dukkha, right? Just keeps the original term because maybe there isn't one term that is able to capture all the different types and varieties and meanings of it.
I was just wondering whether you would mind giving a very brief introduction of your history or a bit more about yourself. Just if you don't mind, that would be.
Well, okay, I was born in Sacramento, California, and And my family was Catholic, so I was raised in a Catholic family. We went to church every Sunday, Catholic schools, and so on. And at one point, maybe when I was about 5 years old or so, I really loved going to church, and I even thought about being a nun because we had nuns as teachers in the school. But then that faded after a while. I think one reason was because I felt I wasn't really nun material, because I was kind of a naughty child and got angry a lot, and I had a lot of problems. So I thought I don't think I could make it as a nun. And then as I grew older, I became somewhat dissatisfied with the teachings of the Catholic Church, because we would have, in school we would have classes, we would have to learn. And I found a lot of things were difficult to understand, difficult to accept. And when I would ask questions of the teachers, sometimes they didn't give satisfying answers, or they would just say, well, this is a mystery we can't understand. We just have to have faith and think that God knows what he's doing, and things like that. So I became more and more dissatisfied, to the point where when I was about 13 or 14, I said, I can't be a Catholic. I can't do this. It just doesn't work for me. But I still had this strong interest in something spiritual. I just had to feel there's got to be more than just this world, this crazy. I was very much aware of suffering. And actually that's another difficulty that I had, because I don't know if any of you were raised as Catholics or Christians, but the story is, there's this wonderful God, and he's wise and loving, and he created this wonderful world, and he created all of us, and isn't it wonderful? But I was so much aware of suffering, and I thought, but why is there so much suffering? Why are people hurting each other? Why are children born with disabilities or in poverty and don't have enough food to eat, and so on? So why, if God is really so loving and powerful, why does he allow all this to happen? So it was difficult to reconcile my awareness of the suffering and problems in the world with the story that I was told in the Christian theology. So that was one of the difficulties I had. And so anyway, eventually, when I was a teenager, I got interested in Eastern religions, and I started reading books. I couldn't really tell the difference at that time. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, they all said a lot of similar things, but I was really attracted to those ideas of rebirth, reincarnation, and enlightenment, and so on. So I found myself kind of going more in that direction. And in university, that was difficult too, because I didn't really have the wish to have a career. Most people were studying to become something, and get married, have a family, and so on. And I just wasn't interested in those things at all. And I just felt more and more drawn towards a spiritual life. And in fact, I read one book, I think it was Autobiography of a Yogi. Yeah, really powerful book. And when I read that book, I had this feeling inside of me, that's what I'm supposed to do in my life. I'm supposed to live a contemplative life. And it was kind of scary, because this was the hippie days, free love, free sex, everything. And I thought, wow, I'm not sure if I could do that, give up boyfriends, give up drugs, give up... So there was part of me that was really drawn to that, another part of me that thought, oh, wait a minute. But that feeling just got stronger and stronger and stronger, and finally I got to the point where that was really all I wanted to do. So eventually I left school, and I went traveling, and eventually went to India. This is making a long story short. And I also had this interest in Tibet and the Dalai Lama when I was a teenager. And when I found out the Dalai Lama was living in Dharamsala, when I got to India, then I went straight there. It was just like a magnet. And so there I met the Tibetans, and I started studying Tibetan Buddhism, and so much of it just made sense to me. It was just answering questions that I'd had, and so on. So that's how I got involved in this path. And very quickly I decided to get ordained, and I stayed in India and Nepal for a couple of years, and that was it. I don't know if you want to know more than that. I don't want to go into all the little details, but is that enough? And then, I met Venerable children in Nepal. So I was already ordained and living in Kopan Monastery in Nepal, and she came. She'd already met Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, who were my main teachers in California, and then came to Nepal to study more with them. So that was in 1976, 77, something like that. So it's almost 40 years. Huh? 40 years. Yeah, okay. So maybe it was 76 when I met her. So a long friendship. Yeah, and so I've been... so I left America when I was about 20. Now I'm 65. And for the last 45 years, most of the time I have not been living in America. I've been living in other countries. Europe, Singapore, Australia. I just come back occasionally for visits. So I'm American. I still have an American passport. I'm sort of... not really long-term resident here. So sometimes I feel a little bit out of touch with what's going on in America.
Venerable, in all of your years of practice, as far as dukkha goes, what have you really, what's been the biggest shift or the biggest deepening for you on the truth of it, the causes of it? I mean, how did that shift from the time that you first met the Dharma? And you always had this sense about the suffering of the world. What have you come to sort of recognize about this whole situation here, and how does that fuel your practice?
What have I come to recognize about
dukkha? I mean,
suffering.
Really, what this is about in relationship to your own life? I mean, and how do you see the path? What are like maybe one or two points that have really gotten you like really focused and really boom about getting out of here?
Getting out of suffering.
Cyclic existence. Out of cyclic existence, really, the whole idea of liberation and awakening. I mean, because suffering, when I first, I mean, there's the gross levels and stuff. When you start getting into looking at the different kinds of dukkha, I mean, that the subtler types and the change and things like that. Has there been any one or two particular teachings that really went in very, very deeply and shifted you in a very specific way?
I'm not really sure what to say, but I feel very convinced that a big part of our suffering is our mind, our attitude about it. Yeah, and that we make suffering worse than it has to be by the way we deal with it. So for me, that's a really, really good. So I was really happy to talk about this topic because it's so relevant, that so much of our suffering is mentally created by our own mind. And if we can just learn to make shifts in our thoughts and our attitudes, the way our mind is looking at things, that relieves, it may not relieve all of our suffering, but it certainly relieves a lot of it, the unnecessary suffering. It's like there's this saying that's kind of, I don't know where it came from, but it's kind of popular in America, that I think it's pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Have you come across that one? It's really true. And it's what the Buddha is saying in that sutra, that yes, we do get struck by arrows, we can't avoid that. That is unavoidable, as long as we're not yet enlightened. But the additional suffering that our mind creates, in the way, how our mind deals with it, that is something we can deal with, we can reduce. Even though I know that intellectually, it's still so hard to do it. There's still that, gut level reaction. Oh no, not again. I don't want this. Like when my computer wasn't working, I had this slideshow I wanted to show. But yeah, I can really see in myself that just through the Buddhist practice, meditation, mindfulness, so many methods, they really do work. They really do help to at least, reduce the unnecessary suffering and just be with the raw experience. And sometimes that raw experience isn't really that bad, It's interesting. I don't know if there's a book called The Buddha's Brain. Have you come across that? Rick Hansen, Buddha's Brain. Wonderful book. And he talks about this analogy of the arrows. He uses the word dart instead of arrow. But he said something in there quite interesting. He says, actually, which is surprising, he said most of the second arrow reaction happens when there really isn't a first arrow. I was quite surprised. And he gave an example. He said, for example, coming home and the house is a mess, This is probably something he experienced. Kids, you come home and there's just things all over the place and it's a mess. And he says that's not really inherently painful, right? There's nothing inherently there in the clothes and the toys and everything that's cause of suffering. It's not really, really painful. But the mind's reactions to it, oh no, not again, I've told them, and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff, getting angry, having attachment to things being a certain way, and taking it all very personally, they're not listening to me. So it's, the mind is making this big deal out of something which isn't really inherently painful. Yeah? So that's really interesting, right? When you look at the actual situation, and is this really bad? Is this really painful? Sometimes it's not. And he also said in some cases you can have these second arrow reactions when it's actually something positive. And he gave the example of somebody compliments you, somebody praises you, says something nice to you, but the way you react is, oh no, I don't deserve it, or you feel guilty, you feel embarrassed, you feel, yeah? I know that I do that, I feel really uncomfortable when people praise me or compliment me, and it's like, wait a minute, that's something positive. They're trying to be kind to me, be nice to me. Why am I reacting that way? So that's really interesting, isn't it? It's just, wow, this mind that we have. But this is the wonder, what I love so much about Buddhism is just looking at the mind and understanding you don't have to buy into or believe in or follow every thought, every whatever that comes up in your mind. You have a choice. And just that awareness itself, just realizing I have a choice. I don't have to buy into this. I don't have to believe in this. It's just something in my mind. It's not me. It's just a passing cloud, a passing thought in my mind. Wow, that itself is like magic. It's so helpful. Maybe sometimes it's quite hard to do that, but when we can do it, it's helpful.
So I'm so grateful for the reminder to bring the mind into that non-physical idea, because I'm wondering about the genesis of when the mind became so associated and embroiled with the brain. And I particularly want to know your perspective on when people have brain afflictions, actual mental illnesses that affect wiring in the brain, and how there's this attitude that if we just think our way out of it, we'll be okay, and the frustration that happens with that. And so just keeping those two things separate and encouraging that people need to get their physical bodies healthy in order for the mind to be healthy as well. I'm just wondering if you can shed some light on that.
Well, there's a couple of questions there. Can you just maybe, what is the actual question you have?
The actual question is, how do you advise people who are suffering with mental illness to, I don't know, maybe give themselves a break, that it's not necessarily totally the mind's responsibility, that there's actually something awry in the physical brain?
Yeah. Well, this is a somewhat tricky question because, traditionally, at least in Tibetan Buddhism, I don't know about other forms of Buddhism, they don't mention the brain at all. They only talk about the mind. And I'm happy that the Dalai Lama has been engaging in these conferences and discussions with scientists, brain scientists and psychologists and so on and so forth, and that he's really open to listening and learning and incorporating science into his own teachings. So this is actually something quite new, and I think, as far as I know, I haven't been following it all, but as far as I know, there's still a lot of areas where they're exploring and trying to understand this mind-brain connection. At one point the Dalai Lama said that the mind is definitely dependent on the brain, at least the more coarse or gross levels of the mind. But then in Tibetan Buddhism they talk about more subtle levels of the mind, like the mind that leaves the body and takes rebirth, transmigrates, that is not dependent on the brain. That's able to exist, to continue even after the brain has died. So he's acknowledging that there is a connection, there is a interrelation, interdependence. But I think, as far as I know, I could be wrong, they're still not quite sure. But also Western scientists are still exploring the brain. They still don't fully understand everything about the brain. So I think there's a lot of question marks and a lot of need for further exploration in that. But it does seem that definitely, because when people have certain brain injuries or take certain chemicals, it definitely changes their mind, the way the mind experiences things. So we can't deny that there's a connection. But as far as people suffering from mental illness, this is also a somewhat difficult thing, because our tradition usually teaches meditation and how important it is to meditate. On the other hand, when people are suffering from certain mental illnesses, and I don't know if it even needs to be as serious as a mental illness, but even, say, panic attacks, people who suffer from panic attacks or PTSD. I haven't had a lot of experience with that, but I've heard that sometimes meditation is not helpful. It can actually cause the panic, the fear, the symptoms to become worse. So often in meditation retreats, meditation and courses and so on, people are asked if they have any history of mental illness, if they're taking any medication for mental illness. And that needs to be dealt with in a very careful way. So my feeling is meditation isn't necessarily so helpful for everybody. Some people may need medication, therapy, and other things to help them deal with their problems before they meditate. And maybe for some people it may be better not to do meditation. But I don't have full awareness, full knowledge of that whole area. I don't know if that's answering your question or not. Yeah. So I know there's a lot of people working on this area, bringing psychological methods and Buddhist methods and bringing them together. But I'm just knowledgeable about the Buddhist side of things and not so much the psychological side of things. Mm-hmm. Yes, I've heard sometimes people say that they feel as if they're almost attached to their suffering. They're addicted to their suffering and don't have this motivation to change. Although they can see, in one sense, they can see that it's suffering, but it's very difficult to get motivated to do anything about it, to change it. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Of course you can't force people. It has to be done voluntarily. Buddha never tried to force anybody to change themselves. He just was there, showing what he had done, talking about what he had done, but left it up to people to decide for themselves if they wanted to follow this path or not. So, I feel that way too. I don't feel it's up to me to tell somebody else, this is what you should do, you should change yourself. maybe people need to get to a certain point where they're really fed up, fed up with the suffering, and then want to change. But if that's coming from outside, sometimes people just dig their heels in and become defensive and no, what are you trying to tell me? I don't want to change. So I think it does have to come from within oneself. And that's really all I can say about it. So, one thing I feel, I don't know if this is really relevant to your question, but like Gandhi saying, be the change you would like to see in the world. So I feel that's so true, that if you would like other people to change or the world to change, you've got to embody that change yourself. And if you can live those changes, if you can live this new way of being, this new way of dealing with situations, more happy, more peaceful, and so on, if people are ready to be open to that, interested in that, and so on, then they will be. So without having to preach to them or tell them anything, they will be drawn to that. I don't know, for me that's a much better approach than preaching or pushing or even encouraging people what they should do. That wouldn't work for me. That just puts me off. I'm that kind of person, if you're trying to tell me to do something, I don't want to do it. But if you just invite me, make it available, then I'm more interested. I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but yeah. But I'm sure that the wish to change oneself has to come from within. And also changing oneself has to come from it. Nobody else can do it for you. You yourself have to come to the point where you feel, this is what I want to do. I guess it's the same with drug addicts and alcoholics. Nobody can force them to change, to give up that habit. It has to come from within themselves. And as I understand, it's usually they really get fed up. They really get to the point where they feel this is just suffering, and I don't want to do this anymore. So until they're convinced of that, they won't want to change. I don't know, does that make sense, what I'm saying? I don't know if you agree or not, but